Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and get back to the BEC final review, and I apologize for all the different videos you're having to watch. So this is the third video now. My system's just giving me a real hard time today, and so it kept cutting off the camera at various times. So it did it again. As I was finishing up the discussion of variance analysis. So let's just go ahead and find ourselves back pretty much where we had left off, which we were talking about the different variances, and you have to know the variances. We have flashcards around there. You've got to know those, very fluidly. Okay, you can't mess with that. You've got to know those. You're going to be looking at those, the day of your exam. Okay, you got to know those, as I said, about 15 points on variance analysis. So I don't think I can stress that any more than I have. So let's just go ahead and see how we might practice with some questions using the variance analysis. And let me put myself into full screen mode. And I'm not sure why they won't let me make these icons over here a little bigger anymore. They used to be bigger, now they decided to be tiny. But I'll just go ahead and accept that. Okay, so what happens? Flatbush Corporation has a standard costing system for each of its products. The standard direct materials cost to produce a unit, and they start to give me some information there. And then I look down and I peek down and I say, okay, they want the materials usage variance. So at that point, I'm considering what formula I'm going to use, because I know that I'm going to pick the numbers out of that formula to quickly get to the right answer. So I know that for the materials usage, which is what this is, the materials usage variance, right? I'm going to have to take what? I'm going to have to take the standard price. I'm going to multiply that by the standard quantity minus the actual quantity. Again, remember, I use that standard price because I'm just trying to isolate the effect of using less or more quantity materials than I needed. Now, I have to be careful that since it's the materials usage, I have to make sure that I pick up the materials used here, right? Okay, so I go ahead and I start to take a look, and I can go through and start to fill in this approach that we have here as I see the information I need. So they tell me standard direct material cost to produce a unit of Premier products is 4 pounds of material at what? At $2.50 per pound. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to stick that $2.50 there. I know what the standard price is, right? Okay, or $10 per unit. During May year one, 8,400 pounds of material costing $20,160 were purchased to produce 2,000 units of Brook. So now I'm going to look at them and say, well, look, I know that they were supposed to use what? I know that they did use, I should say, to get the actual quantity used. They tell me 8,400 pounds of material were purchased and used. Okay, so there's my 8,400. Now be careful, because those numbers could be different in the question. They could give you different amount purchased versus used. It was the same number though. So I go ahead and I take this 8,400, and then I have to figure out, well, what was the standard quantity that should have been used, right, to get the standard quantity. And so it's what? They produced 2,000 units, and they are supposed to use 4 pounds of material per unit. Okay, so I go ahead and I multiply that times the 4 pounds, and that means they should have used what? 8,000 pounds, but they used 8,400. So now I sit here and I have this what? I have this 400 times what? Times the 250. This, the difference is the 400. I'll put that in the parentheses just so we're seeing where that 400 came from. Times this 250. I always wanted to put a decimal in front for some reason. okay, times the 250. Okay, so 400 times 250 gives me what? And notice, guys, this is a negative, right? 8,000 minus 400. We always put the actual, the standard first, the actual second, so that if I use too much, I get a negative number. So that will help me remember that it's unfavorable. So I get a negative 1,000. Okay, and so that's 1,000 what? Unfavorable, right? All right. Okay, good. So notice, guys, that if you've got the trick is having the formula, right? And then just teasing out the information that you need to be able to answer the question, okay? Now we take a look at this next one, and this is another variance question, but now we're going to use the labor rate variance. Now, when we look at the labor rate variance, now it's going to be the actual hours, which I'm abbreviating AH here, right? Actual hours, and it's going to be standard rate minus the actual rate. So again, I am going to use the actual hours to allow me to evaluate what is the effect of having a rate that's different than the standard. And again, I always put the actual second. So if I use too much, that number comes out negative. I know it's unfavorable. If I use less, or 0, then it will come out what? If I use less or those numbers are the same. That's generally not the case. But if it comes out that the standard was more, then that's going to give me a positive number in the parentheses and make that positive, have that be a favorable variance, right? So now I need to go ahead and I start to pick up some numbers here, and they tell me that the labor cost was 104,500 for 9,500 hours worked. Okay, good. So I know right out of the gate, I got to pick up that 9,500. And now I should be able to go ahead and pick up the actual rate, because I know that if I worked 104,500, okay, and I'm kind of writing this too low down here. I don't want you to think that's for the next question. Okay, I know if I have 104,500, okay, and I divide that by what? The 9,500 actual hours worked, I put that into my calculator. And by the way, guys, always use your calculator for this kind of stuff. Don't trust, your head to do these. You've got a lot of things going on during the exam. They gave you a calculator, use it. So that's $11, right, per hour. Just doing the math on that. That's $11. And then I need to just figure out what the standard rate is. So I look at this question a little bit more, and they said that what? Each unit is expected to require what? 4 labor hours at, thank you, $10 per hour, right? The expected is the standard. Okay, so I go ahead and I do the math on that. That's what? 9,500 times a negative 1. That gives me what? 9,500 minus, which means it is what? It is unfavorable. Okay, so as you look at these questions, guys, the key thing, and you're going to look at every single one of them in your homework, you're going to look at every single one of them in the final review, and by the time you've repeated these enough going into your exam, days before your exam, you would have drilled on a bunch of these. These become a pretty, pretty solid 15 points for you on the exam, and you're saving time. Okay, they're expecting the candidates are going to meander around these questions, and you're going to have these all set up. Why? Because you've got these formulas so clear in your mind, right? Okay, now the next one, I look down and they're asking me the variable overhead spending variance. Well, that's like the rate variance for my labor. Okay, so it's going to be what? Let's just look back. It's going to be the actual hours, and then it's going to be whatever the standard overhead rate is minus the actual overhead rate. Okay, so I go ahead and I start picking up some of those numbers. And in this one now, they tell me that they worked, well, let's read the question a little bit more carefully. Norwood Corporation produces a single product. The standard cost for 1 unit is, and they start giving me information about materials, labor. Here we go. Variable manufacturing overhead, what they're asking for the question. And I'm not a big fan of having to look down and see what it was that the question was asking before you start to look at the material. But for these questions, yeah, it's helpful to know that you're in a variance analysis question and you want to know what variance they're asking you, because they start giving you information about materials that is not relevant, right, to this. So I don't want you to have to sit there and read through all that when you're knowing now that they're asking me the variable overhead spending variance, the rate variance, right? So I go ahead and they give me the $5 is the standard rate. Thank you very much. Okay. Now I keep reading and they say 4,000 units were produced, the costs associated, materials, I don't care, materials, I don't care. Direct labor, and I'm looking at this and I'm going to have to go ahead and realize that what? It's $5 per hour, and they really don't tell me very clearly here that they're using direct labor hours as the driver, but I'm going to have to go ahead and accept that here unless they tell me somewhere what is the variable spending rate. Yeah, this question, and I could maybe see the CPA exam doing this to you, is a little bit mean because they don't tell me what the driver is here. So you have to be careful to see that you know what the driver is, or in this case, you're going to have to go ahead and just sort of make the leap of faith here that for overhead, direct labor hours is commonly accepted as the driver. So the actual hours were what? 8,200 hours. So that's a little annoying that they didn't just make that more clear. But 8,200 hours, and then $5 is the standard. And then if I want to know what the actual overhead rate was for the period, variable overhead rate, it was 41,820, and they are using what? Hours as the driver. So the actual was not $5 per hour. The actual was what? Was $5.10 per hour. Okay, so I again get the standard first. I've got a negative 10 cents here. That should give me a negative 820. That means that it is unfavorable. And I look and I've got this negative 820 unfavorable. Okay. So that one was a little tougher in that I sort of had to make a leap there. And I don't know why they do that with exam questions. I guess they're just trying to test your ability to sort of work through where there's unknown information. What would be the best information to allow you to answer a question? Okay. All right, good, good. So that gets us through the standard for the variance analysis. And again, you are going to have to know that stuff very, 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 very well on the exam. I think I've said that enough, so I'm not going to sit here and keep repeating myself on that. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue on now, looking at quickly the discussion about variables versus and I'll let you look at some of these things, guys. Again, a lot of these things are definitional. Okay, but I do want to look a little bit at variables versus absorption costing. Variables full costing required by GAAP. Variables costing is really something that we use for internal analysis as we're going through and we're making internal decisions about our contribution margin, break-even analysis, and we're going to take a look at some of those things here in a minute. Now, the big difference between absorption and variables, as we said during the class time, is our treatment of the fixed cost. All fixed costs are treated as a period cost under variables, whereas under absorption, if our fixed costs are what, and it's probably in our fixed manufacturing overhead, are working their way through the balance sheet, work in process, finished goods, and then the cost of goods sold, we don't take those fixed costs as a expense until we actually, or as a cost of goods sold until we actually sell the units. All selling and administrative costs are what are considered a period cost. And so the difference between the two methods is the treatment of the fixed manufacturing overhead. Okay, so it is somewhat useful to remember how if our sales increased, for the period, or our inventory, I should say, increase, meaning that our production was greater than our sales, or inventory increase. So absorption will have a higher net income than variables. If if our inventory decreased because our production or our purchases was less than our sale, then we're going to have variables having the higher net income, because costs that had already been taken, the fixed manufacturing costs that had already been taken as an expense of the previous period, now are under absorption, being released and recognized on the income statement as we sell those items and release those costs that have already been taken as an expense under variables. Of course, if there's no change, the two are the same. So the big takeaway is the difference between our variables and our absorption costing is what is going to be the net income is going to be the calculation of net income is going to be the treatment of our fixed manufacturing cost. Okay, so you go through this question, you keep that in mind. You have this Omni over here, and Omni planned and actually manufactured 200,000 units of a single product in its first year of operations. Variable costs were $30 per unit. A product, plan and fixed manufacturing costs were $600. Selling administrative costs totaled $400,000. Omni sold 120,000 units at a selling price of $40 per unit. They want us to use variable costing. Okay, I know that I'm going to treat all fixed cost as a period expense. So what happens? I sit here and I say, well, if I have a $40 per unit sales price, right? My what? Put sales price over here. My variable costs, they tell me, are this $30 per unit. Okay, that gives me what? That gives me $10 per unit as my, remember, that's my contribution margin, right? So if I have a $10 contribution margin per unit, and I've gone ahead and I've sold according to the material here, I've sold 120,000 units, then I've created contribution margin, right, of 120,000 units times that contribution margin is going to give me $1,200,000 if I'm doing my math correctly. And I look at my note there, and I am. Okay, you always calculate in through your calculator, right? Okay, so $1,200,000 is going to be my contribution margin. But now under variables, I have to do what? Subtract all fixed costs to come up with my operating income. So they told me that the fixed manufacturing costs were $600,000. Since I'm under variables, I'll subtract that. And if we're sitting here and we're doing selling and administrative cost, that's $400,000. Okay, so we subtract both of those, and then that gives me what my answer here, which is $200,000 operating income under variables. Now be careful. You can't, in this example, just sit there and say, okay, so I just add back the fixed manufacturing cost, and that would be my net income under absorption. No, because what? Because we sold some units, and some of the fixed manufacturing costs did go against my sales and calculating my contribution, not contribution margin, but my gross profit. So they would have affected my net income. So it's not as simple as just adding back. You have to go through the whole calculation. This is my sales. This would be my cost of goods sold. You'd have to figure out, well, what is my fixed cost per unit? That's the fixed cost per unit that need to be included in the cost of goods sold, along with the variable cost per unit. And then, of course, you'd still subtract, that part would be consistent. You'd still subtract your selling and administrative costs from that to come up with the answer for absorption. Okay. All right, good. Those questions, you do need to be comfortable with those. You do need to practice with those in your homework from the regular text, and as you go through and work all your final review, multiple choice questions. And don't forget, I also want you to work all the task-based simulations here. Okay. Now, break-even analysis, and they start giving us a formula here, et cetera, and how to get it in dollars and whatnot. I really think that these things are so basic for us that I really just want to go ahead and jump down to this example question here now of what is the break even with the information that they give us. And I'm going to just show you how to think through these. You probably need a flashcard to help you remember how to calculate break even, but it's so basic. I don't see you remembering how to do this is going to be terribly difficult for you. Okay, so let's just review this question. Okay, so they tell us that they have all this information, okay, sales price, etc. And you look at this and you say, okay, but how many units are involved here? Okay, so you start to take a look and you say, well, look, if they have sales of 900,000, okay, and if the sales price is $20, okay, of per unit, then I can go ahead and I can do the math on this. 900,000 divided by the $20 is going to give me what, 45,000 units of sale, right? Okay, that's the units that they sold. But this isn't asking me that. It's asking me what's the break even, okay? And so what do I want to do here? Well, first, I'm going to have to go ahead and figure out what my contribution margin per unit is. And so if my sales price is $20 per unit, then I just start picking up my variable costs per unit, and prime costs are manufacturing overhead and my not manufacturing overhead, but my direct material and my direct labor. Direct material, direct labor, those are variable costs, so I know I have to take that off, right? And then I have what? Then I have the variable overhead, that's $1, okay? And then I have the variable selling and administrative, that's $1. So I subtract those variable costs off, right? And so $20 sales price minus $7 worth of variable cost gives me a contribution margin here of what, not 7, but minus 8, gives me contribution margin of $12 per unit. Okay, good. Now I've got that contribution margin. Now I go ahead and I'm just going to set up the problem to say, okay, so the answer to this, the break even, okay, in units, let's just do it in units first, okay? Break even in units is going to be calculated by doing what? Taking the contribution margin per unit. Write the elements that I need to consider times the break even in units. Okay, that has to equal my fixed cost. Okay, now I start to take a look and I say, okay, but I know now that my contribution margin per unit is $12 times the break-even units. But at this point, I haven't seen anything that tells me what my total fixed costs are, but I know from looking at the question here that I have what, $7, I have $3. So I have what, a $10 per unit fixed cost. And if I did what, if I have 45,000 units that I sold, I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, 45,000 units times the $10, 7 plus 3 is $10 of fixed cost. That means that my fixed costs are 450,000. Well, if my fixed costs are 450,000, and now I can sit here and I can say, okay, 450,000 divided by what? By the $12, right? Divide both sides by $12. That gives me what? That gives me a break even in units here now, right? Just doing this math, break even in units, 45,000, 450,000 divided by the 12 units should give me, okay, 37,500 units, okay? And The way I wrote that makes me a little nervous. Let me double check my calculation. Okay, so 450,000 divided by what? 12. Yeah, it gives me 37,500 units. Now look, that's great, but the question wasn't asking me for the break-even point in units. It was asking me for the break-even point in sales dollars, but I know that they're planning to sell those for what? For $20 per unit. So if you take 37,500 units times $20, that gives me $750,000, the correct answer to this question. Okay, now that is a surefire way to be able to answer the question, but you may want to look at this and say, well, hang on a minute. If I can sit here and come up with the contribution margin ratio, then I can quickly turn this answer into dollars without having to make this additional calculation here. So I know my contribution margin per unit is $12, and therefore my contribution margin ratio would be $12 divided by $20. I have a contribution margin ratio here of 0.6. Now I'd still have to calculate this number, okay? But now I sit here and I say, well, 450,000 divided by that contribution margin ratio of 0.6, $450,000, right, divided by 0.6 is going to give me the same answer, the 750,000. Okay, so that's probably a little quicker way of calculating that without having to do this extra calculation of turning the units into dollars. Whichever way you're comfortable with, guys, you save a little time doing it with the contribution margin ratio, but if you're stuck with that and you're having trouble with that ratio, do it that longer way. The important thing is that you are systematic about how you go about in doing these. You treat every single one of these questions the same way. That's how you start to yield time, because learning curve kicks in and you just start doing these quicker and quicker. So practice both ways, see which way you're comfortable with, but make sure that you're consistent in how you're doing these as you're going through your practice and obviously on the exam.